From Immersive Labs, this is Cyber Humanity. Hello again, I'm your host Chris Pace. Cyber Humanity is the podcast taking cyber security personally, trying to get inside the heads of hackers, as well as putting our feet in the shoes of defenders. These podcasts essentially come in two flavours, either us ranting about themes close to the hearts of security types, or us chatting about threat and security stuff from recent weeks. This week, we are only going to talk about one thing. In fact, we're only going to talk about one man, really, and that is Edward Snowden. You might be thinking, well, Chris, that was 7 years ago. Why would we want to bother talking about him? And no one cares anyway, and it doesn't really divide opinion in any way, so what's the point in talking about it? Well, actually, this week, news has come from the US, the US Appeals Court, 9th District in the US, who have ruled the warrantless telephone dragnet that secretly collected millions of Americans' telephone records did violate the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and may very well have been unconstitutional. So that is to suggest that the very thing, or one of the very things at least, that Edward Snowden blew the whistle on has been deemed to be illegal by a court in the US. So as that story was in the news, we thought, well, we could revisit this and take a look at what happened in the story of Ed Snowden, a little bit of a timeline. We'll also talk a bit about the two movies, the one documentary, and obviously also the Oliver Stone what do they call them? What do they call movies that are about people?
Like a dramatization.
Biopic?
Was it a do they call them a biopic?
Biopic.
But let's begin at the beginning, because I won't pretend to be any kind of expert when it comes to this story at all. I've read some articles. I know a little bit of stuff. I know that he exfiltrated... There you go. That's a security word for you straight away. He exfiltrated data from... I just realised I haven't introduced any of you. Perhaps I'm just going to do this on my own.
Well, actually, Chris, you're the only one that can talk about this without any kind of risk. So, like, maybe you should just do the whole podcast, and we'll just like boo and hiss in the background.
I have no clearance, Clarence.
He's a hero. Boo! A traitor! Yay!
I wonder which side you're on.
Oh, did I set myself? I think have I gone too soon?
Should at least introduce my secret cyber squirrels, Kev Breen, Max Vetter, and Paul Bentham.
No, well, I'm not here. I'm not here.
Oh, no one's seen...
No,
Paul?
nobody's seen me.
Can neither confirm nor deny the presence of Paul on the podcast.
I do think we just have to a little bit explain that this is going to be a bit like when we try to talk about SANS and the NCC Group Crest stuff. This is a little bit of a difficult podcast for at least 3/4 of us, because we've all at times worked for the UK government and can't really remember what we do or don't know officially. And so we're probably just going to like quickly Google and then check before we say anything.
You've really presented the security and intelligence services in such a highly professional light during that statement.
I should also really point out that we're all techie geeks rather than like lawyers or PR or marketing or professionals. So.
And we're definitely not hitmen, unless I forgot that I was a hitman, in which case, I'm sorry.
I'm going to have a go at telling the like basic story. So 2013, Edward Snowden, a contractor working for the National Security Agency, living in Hawaii, actually, I really don't like him so bad. I can't even give an unbiased intro. He was a systems administrator or systems architect, and he flew to Hong Kong and started talking to journalists about a load of data that he had extracted from classified systems. And that was 7 years ago. And the people who disclosed that information to worked for the Guardian newspaper, the Washington Post, and Der Spiegel. And those journalists, irrespective of my view on the actual disclosure, did an incredibly good job of doing the investigative journalism on the reams and reams and reams of highly technical and complicated information to tell a story that I think we have to acknowledge, irrespective of our views on whether it was a good way to achieve this, that has changed the internet, has changed the way the intelligence agencies in both the UK and the US operate, and created 7 years on a highly controversial debate about whether this guy was a hero, a whistleblower, a dissident, a traitor, or a patriot. And I think this podcast is going to expose our individual views on those topics.
One thing I do know is that not only the impact on all of those landscapes, but also the impact on the cybersecurity landscape as well. I'm sure we'll get into how some of these revelations have impacted directly on the nature of threats that we have seen over those 7 years. So that's one thing I do know about.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating angle as well, actually. So skipping all the way past all of this, it was kind of popular a couple of years ago to have Snowden at your conference, and I went to this conference in Dublin, and the whole thing, like Edward Snowden, there was. I don't even know why I went. It was like such a bad idea, but I went kind of a business development thing in an old role. And the whole advertisement of the conference featured the fact that Snowden was going to appear live. And I thought, you know what, this is really interesting. This is a cybersecurity conference. They're going to talk about the fact that this guy did the most famous insider threat, data breach, and how did he do it? What was his modus operandi? How would he have been caught? What should have the internal monitoring been like? Why was he able to download so much data? Why was that data not segmented, etc., 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 etc.? And actually what happened was, and I should have known this because his sodding picture was like literally the full size of the auditorium.
Paul, are there moments where you'd like us to let you know that you're doing it, or do you just want to carry on doing it?
What have I done?
Rant. You're spiraling, Paul.
It's like we could see the beads of sweat.
I'm only at Fortissimo. I'm going to go to. And this guy's face is so huge, and I should have realised it wasn't going to be an intellectual debate about cybersecurity and insider threat and data breaches. But actually, what it was this cybersecurity person literally worshipping Snowden on stage with all of us just watching, which was. Like, how amazing! Look at all this data, like you breached, and what a transformation was, and what a hero you are. Like, you did a massive data breach, and we're a cybersecurity conference, and you're not even talking about that bit. What is wrong with you?
Okay, so there it was.
But that is the angle where we do have it is safe to talk about the insider threat and where. If the conference didn't talk about it, maybe that's where we could and let Paul maybe calm down a bit, and then we can talk about as an insider threat. That is the one the one thing that you talk about is we've got an insider threat. Yeah, it was like the Snowden thing. That's and we can talk about the how someone had access to that much data in a classified in any terms, but especially in a classified environment, how we got them out, how it was so easy, all those things that are actually really interesting to cybersecurity professionals rather than, and we'll get back to whether it's right and wrong and privacy issues later as well.
It changed the core of the internet. It's like, it's regardless of whether you think what he did was right or wrong, like the impact, the release of that information, the understanding that, governments may be doing kind of dragnet activities, like completely changed the way web servers talk to each other, the way like organizations talk to each other, the way data encryption comes along. It's fundamentally changed all of that, arguably for the better. Better for privacy, arguably worse for government agencies wanting to potentially intercept.
And I mean, in terms of encryption, yeah, end-to-end encryption, no one would have known that term 7 years ago. The term end-to-end encryption now you see on every message you ever send. And that is a massive change to what 7 years ago, everything was just unencrypted. And, whether you're a website or whether you're, normal HTTP websites were around by the dozen, which has clearly helped us all. Now, from my kind of police hat and when we were going through this, when I was training people before, moving into government, the police would say, "Oh, well, they're using encryption, so it's kind of impossible." I think it just moves the goalposts. If you have to monitor people, yeah, okay, it's harder, but you just have to then get better and develop new kind of ways that you can do it. So I do think it's, in terms of the public, it's definitely helped encrypt everything we should be encrypting to stop the bad guys seeing it. But obviously it's caused other issues for law enforcement and intelligence services as well.
Yeah, it's not. No, I don't think anyone has any, any person has any problems with the concept of surveilling people for the purposes of stopping them doing nefarious stuff.
I think some people do, but
I think where the challenge has come with Snowden was that it was the addition of the word mass to surveillance that really caused the problem. It is the idea that they were basically eavesdropping on almost everyone, and that that was bound to create moral difficulties with those inside that organization, because let's not forget, he wasn't the only one. There were whistleblowers before Snowden who took a more official line. Perhaps they trod a little more carefully, maybe for other reasons, and they weren't prepared to quite put their toe, their foot, leg, whole body right in the water. But they certainly made clear that there were things happening in that agency post 9/11 that they didn't like.
One of the really important things that I should say is that I've watched the Oliver Stone thing. That's because Chris made me over the weekend to prep for this.
It was great though, wasn't it? We all had a great time. It was great.
I'm going to have to buy a new freaking rucksack because for some reason he's using my rucksack in that film. Bloody films cost me a fortune.
I'd love to tell you that I knew that, and that's why I made you watch it.
Expense a new rucksack.
It's an act. It's an actor, Paul. It's an actor. It's fine.
But I haven't watched The Citizen 4 so I don't quite, and I haven't read, I've read an extract from his memoir, and oh my actual God, how, if there's, I don't know whether he was crazy and then he's just got worse since he's gone to Russia, or the fact that he's living in Russia in isolation, in a totalitarian regime, which obviously he doesn't like, but obviously he flew to when he was having a little bit of a crisis about the I don't really understand that bit of it. He's lost the plot, is what it seems.
He's got his girlfriend out there with him.
A wife now. They got married apparently. Yeah.
That did strike me as odd. And
what, that he got married?
No.
That he went to that he was so disappointed in what the Western intelligence agencies were doing that he flew all the way to wait for it, Hong Kong, and then went, oh, actually, I'm gonna go to Russia now. Any kind of examples of abuse of powers in either of those countries?
Well, so the EFF, so EFF lawyers, so after he came out, they started to look at representation. EFF lawyers were talking about where they could send him. So they were talking about sending him to Ecuador and to Iceland, places that had no non-extradition stuff. And he's like, nah, Russia.
Yeah, what's wrong with the Ecuadorian embassy?
Yeah, we could all live in a broom cupboard in the Ecuadorian embassy for years.
The fact is, there are tens and thousands of people who work in the intelligence agencies, and you can name on one hand the people that have gained press coverage for leaking this out. So either there's a load of people who are doing stuff that is ethically, morally questionable day in, day out, or some people who want to cut personal notoriety have decided to go into press like WikiLeaks, or in this example, there were 1,000 different internal routes. If you have a question, a concern, there is independent representatives if you have an ethical question, and these weren't put in place post Snowden leaks. These have been in place for decades, and every single person is security cleared and vetted in order to make sure that they can handle the kind of work. I remember vividly from my first security clearance interview, I'm half Czech, so one of the questions that they asked me in that interview is, do you have an issue with the UK having a nuclear deterrent? And when England and the Czech Republic play football, who do you support? The question of patriotism, the question of identity, the question of belief in what the agencies do is core to the employment of every single person in those agencies. So the fact that there's so few people that have leaked anything about what's going on, it for me says that Snowden's leaks were his own personal profile building rather than anything else.
I see the rationale, and I understand what you're saying, but I think sort of the grey area is not things that are like, something is explicitly and obviously unethical. Like that's a different thing to there is a grey area of ethics, and a person thinks it's important enough to let the rest of the world know that's what's happening. Now, in this context, we began this podcast with me reading a story about how a high court in the US has ruled that mass surveillance was illegal. So
it's very important to say that all of GCHQ's work is carried out in accordance with a strict legal and policy framework, which ensures our activities are authorised, necessary, and proportionate.
Oh, God.
He
is the legal guy.
In fairness, we can probably just stop now because that cleared up everything.
It's important to say that. So he didn't just WikiLeaks this. He didn't just come in and go, here's hundreds of thousands of documents, like publish them all. Like they were selective about what he wanted to release. So they made sure that they were releasing stuff about programs that may exist, but they made sure not to reveal anything that implicated individuals. According to one of the defensive courts, 1.5 million documents were stolen, and we've only seen like 65,000 of those. There's a significant portion of content that he may still have in his possession that was never released. And this includes stuff that was like exactly how they're doing that intercept, how to avoid those things. And he chose not to release those. So it wasn't just carte blanche, release everything, is what I'm saying.
That's my question about the going back to the kind of insider cybersecurity side of things. So he chose not to, and as we've said, the Guardian writers did a really good job of not making that data, getting any data out there that was dangerous to operations and things like that. But how do we know both the journalists and Edward Snowden kept that data secure themselves? Like I remember from Citizen 4, they go through, basically Edward Snowden is teaching Laura Petraeus about how to use encryption, how to have secure password. Like literally he's teaching them as in a hotel room in Hong Kong. Like what happens when so the journalists might have done a really good job, but they now have that data. If I was a Russian spy, I'd just go, oh, let's go to the journalist department, steal all that data, now we're done.
They don't need to. They intercepted him at the airport, and he had the piece of paper with the password written on it. They were the journalists were transferring data to each other, so they had to get some stuff from Brazil back to the Guardian. They loaded it onto a USB stick that was using a TrueCrypt volume, but he had the password to the TrueCrypt volume written on a piece of paper in his pocket. So when they stopped him at the airport, they were able to get that, decrypt it, and take the data. So despite them training the journalists to do it properly, they still didn't apply the principles.
That's my question. So there could be other people out there that didn't want notoriety and didn't want to give it to journalists and didn't want to do all that, but gave it to the Russians or the Chinese anyway. Like that's the thing. Once you can get this data, right, why wouldn't it have been leaked in some other way by someone who may just want £1 million in a Bitcoin account rather than actually go to the journalist? I think that's my problem with the cybersecurity side of this, is how do we know all that data hasn't been shared with foreign intelligence agencies already?
Do you think that's really true? Because back at the end of August of this year, a special forces guy in the US, like a former Green Beret, who was like a Russia expert, it turned out that he's just been indicted for handing secrets over or being part of some sort of espionage. So it obviously happens.
And the Chinese, there were lots of guys arrested in America as spying for the Chinese recently as well. It's it is ongoing, isn't it? But yeah, how does it apply in this context? Like from a cybersecurity background, should they have been more secure? Like, how did he get his hands on all that stuff? And was it ridiculous that he could get his hands on the amount of classified data in the first place?
What I love about the Oliver Stone film kind of makes him out to be this and he's made himself out in post post leak to be this kind of uber like senior technical person, and especially in that film.
It takes 4.5 hours. I've done it in 37.5 minutes.
So in the film, Edward Snowden, I can't remember what the program that he claims to have built, because when he goes and joins, is it Heartbeat? No, it was something like the backup thing that he talked about that got misused, which it didn't make any technical sense whatsoever. Like, and I don't think it's at all related to anything. But what's really interesting is how big he in the film is portrayed, which is a dramatization. It's got to be interesting and sell film tickets. But he's also perpetuated this, like that he's like this super uber talker on any topic related to data privacy, etc. But like the reality is, and I obviously didn't know him, but General Alexander, who was the head of the NSA at the time, referenced him as a SharePoint administrator. Edward Snowden.
Yeah, his name. It's funny how no one can really decide what his job was, and it goes anywhere from like intelligence analyst / contractor, and then that's when we hear about Booz Allen Hamilton and all that. Or at the other end of the spectrum, it's like he ran the help desk, or he was the SharePoint administrator. And it's oddly enough, the name that you give him depends on where you are in the spectrum of whether you love or hate him.
But contractor is a very broad term, isn't it? A contractor
Exactly,
can mean anything. Like, oh, you were contracted in, and it doesn't mean you were doing anything special. You might have just been cleaning the toilets. So,
to get back to what I think the original point was, is so he was afforded that level of access. So as an administrator, we need that level of access. Like if I'm building programs, if I'm using the data, it makes sense that I would have access to that data. That's the whole point of having security clearances. So the fact that he had access to that much data isn't a surprise. The fact that he was able to copy it onto something and walk it out of a top secret secure facility, that's the interesting bit. Like it's like turn off USB devices. Like nobody should be able to plug a USB device in.
I think we should do a little bit on this, right? So like, let's ignore the fact that I despise the stupid prick. But the
oh god!
All right, this just went 18.
Kev, come on. If I don't want people to download all the data about our customers from our own platform, what are we doing to make sure this doesn't happen? So, and let's start with the human side of this, right? So you take an intelligence agency. These people have security cleared in US. This guy's obviously got security clearance through multiple agencies, first with his military training, then the CIA, then NSA. He's taking a polygraph during those elements, which did feature in the film as well. He's obviously then got a privileged user level of access because as a system administrator, a SharePoint administrator, love SharePoint administrators, no offense to any SharePoint administrator, has access to to raw data stored in that system or whatever system they were using. How do I stop an employee who's upset with the quality of the podcast from leaking all of that data out into the public domain?
So there's a couple of things at play there. So one is about data access, and then the other is DLP, data leakage prevention. So when you're figuring out how much people should have access to, we talk about least privilege. So only giving them access to the amount of data that's required for them to do the job. And like we said, you're always going to have employees who need that level of access. They need to be able to read everything. Like your SharePoint admin, he runs SharePoint. SharePoint needs to be able to read every single document. Therefore, by extension, your admin can. So the way you get past this from a security concept is you add auditing. So I want to know every action that admin took. I want to know every file that was downloaded, everything that was uploaded. So you do audit tracking. So that's how we monitor. So that's how we would know that suddenly somebody's transferred 5,000 files off of a SharePoint server onto their local machine.
I think he did it in dribs and drabs more than just like.
Have you not seen the film? He just highlighted everything and 5,000 copy windows open.
Drag and drop, popped it in his pocket, and off he
went. But even still,
yeah.
So auditing still would have highlighted this. You would still see, like looking at audit logs, that there's a lot of activity, and maybe you could explain some of that away. and you can get around that. But that's your first tier, and we do the defense in depth. So first we limit their access, then we audit their access, and then we get on to the preventative measures. So if you've got it on your local machine, fine. I need to make sure you can't get it any further. So I do stuff like no USB devices, no SD cards, no Rubik's Cubes allowed in the building. And I make sure that if you can get it onto your local machine, you can't walk out with your laptop and you can't plug anything in to take it off.
For people who didn't see the film, he's got the USB in the Rubik's Cube.
Well, I want Kev to explain. Kev, can you tell us about, because you got quite excited about the Rubik's Cube. So what now we should clarify, this is heavy poetic, like even by Oliver Stone standards, this is heavy poetic license taken here. But what does he do with the Rubik's Cube?
So in the film, he puts a micro SD card into his laptop, transfers a load of stuff down, copies it onto the SD card in seconds, drops it on the floor, and somebody spots it, and away we go. So he's now got this SD card loaded with all the document he wants to steal. He's got to get it out of the building. So he's got a Rubik's Cube, and this Rubik's Cube must be specially manufactured because a Rubik's Cube doesn't fit an SD card in by default. So it's an extra large Rubik's Cube.
Measured that, Kev.
It's got a little compartment inside it. It's not just a sticker on a cube. So that's completely specially manufactured. Like the manufacturing process he went through to get that Rubik's Cube. And then instead of like sending everything through the scanner, he just throws it to a guard and says, "Hey, have you ever seen a Rubik's Cube?" And the guard's like, "No."
That's amazing.
So guard plays with it and then just hands it back to him on the other side of the full body scanner. Yeah.
Why didn't he just put it in his pocket? That's why I don't understand.
Full body scanner. So the full body scanner still would have
it would
detected
pick it up, wouldn't it? And it's also this is kind of interesting. And again, either his PR is so great and he's just maintaining this like amazing mystique, but he's still not actually said how he did it. So we can take some guesses about how, because and Kev will explain. He had a level of access. I think we've agreed that, but he had to elevate his privileges, surely, to be able to get access to all of that data. It's a lot of documents, right?
Not necessarily. Like Paul said, if he is a SharePoint admin, then he will have access to everything within there. And this could explain why it's potentially 1.5 million documents instead of 10 million documents. Like he'll only have access to the data that's on the SharePoint service. And if he's doing int analyst, then he'll have access to the programs, which is ostensibly what was leaked.
He wasn't doing int analyst.
I have read somewhere, and I don't know if this is accurate, so don't quote me, but I have read somewhere that he didn't have access to enough and kept requesting access, and did use a bit of social engineering, saying like, no, we need it now, we need it straight away, rather than I can't wait for like your boss to get back to me. That's what I can't remember where I read.
So this is something that I can talk about because I don't know anything about it.
You should stick to that principle for every podcast episode.
This is literally how I do every podcast. I talk the most about things I know the least amount about, and this is a topic. So of course this is an NSA breach. So when it all happened, it all got locked down. American protected the whole investigation. There's all NO4 is the code name for that, which means no foreigners. So any UK, I'm sure at the very highest levels there was conversations, but at my worker B level there was nothing. But the Reuters article, which is the one that Max is referring to there, suggests that Edward persuaded. Why have I called him Edward all of a sudden? It's like I'm making friends with him. I'm not making friends with him. Snowden persuaded weak, gullible colleagues, probably manipulated them, the bastard, to give him their passwords. So I don't really know why, whether there was like different systems or there's some sort of segregation of access, maybe Kev, using 25 people, maybe they had download limits, or maybe it was just so that he wasn't spotted. But the kind of weird thing about this whole story is if he's downloading it in dribs and drabs rather than one massive dump that would be less detectable, or whether he's doing it over multiple days or multiple people. Of course, once he's done it, that he's got to go. Like, as soon as he's got it, he leaves and he gets on a plane and he goes to Hong Kong or whatever.
I think that's why it's more credible that, like, whilst he may have staged them all separately, I think it was one walkout. It's like wherever he staged them, like that's the time he copied them off that laptop or off that desktop, walked them out the building in whatever way he did, and never looked back. I don't think he took stuff home separately because the risk was too great. Like, you would never have been, like, I don't think he would have had the confidence to walk back in after stealing the amount he did.
The other thing about this being an SD card, by the way, is who in the NSA decided it would be a good idea to have an SD card reader as part of the desktop? So he must have used a USB stick, not an SD card, which makes the whole Rubik's Cube thing utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, the Rubik's Cube is not how it happened. We know that. The Rubik's Cube is an invention of the directors. Just a really, really good one.
I've got a spy coin. And mine is a British pound coin that you unscrew and it fits a micro SD card in the middle. Obviously never took it in any building.
I was going to say you've just implicated yourself quite severely there.
Yes, I am Edward Snowden.
Is the fact that an Edward Snowden style breach in a highly security vetted environment prove that security vetting your staff actually isn't a great line of defense in this? Or actually, is it just a line of defense, and is a better line of defense to turn off USB or put better DLP monitoring or make sure that you don't do stuff that your employees would think is morally questionable so that they don't feel the need to do something like this? Where do we stand in preventing this happening in the majority of other situations?
If I take a step back, so if we take this away from a highly super secret sensitive government organization and put it to something that's probably more relatable to most of our audience, most organizations are going to have privileged data. Like KFC are going to protect their recipe like nothing else. But they're not air gapped, so they're going to have internet connected systems. If you've got an internet connected system with sensitive data, you've got employees, like you must assume breach. You must assume that an insider threat is going to get it out. Like, there's only so far protective monitoring can get you. I could list like 100 different ways that you could exfiltrate data, and some of them would be easy to detect, some of them would be extremely difficult to detect. So it's all about like layering all those defenses, like making sure that your employees are happy, trustworthy, like maybe some basic background checks to make sure that they're not like properly disgruntled, make sure they haven't come from like competitors. So those kind of things tied together with just good security hygiene. So like least privilege access, auditing, monitoring, and if you can get it, data leakage prevention stuff in.
That's an interesting point you say about normal companies. I mean, we've talked before on the podcast about, you know, your SOC team who are monitoring these logs, and there's things like there's loads of false positives because if you set the, you know, someone downloads 1 kilobyte rather than 1 gigabyte or something, it all goes off, and then people turn off the, you know, obviously monitoring that is a full-time job in itself. Clearly, if these monitoring things were in place, someone missed them. So where, for a normal company, how do you even go about doing that stuff and making sure you catch the real stuff and not the stuff that people are doing for everyday job?
A big part of what we do is like rule tuning and log tuning. So like you'll typically start off with like your first day installing your security equipment, and it says like we can ingest 5 billion logs a day. And it's like, great, turn all the logs on. Like more data is better. And then you start to find yourself flooded with stuff, and false positive fatigue is a completely valid thing. So it's important that you tune your rules. So false positive fatigue is where an analyst gets comfortable recognizing something and goes, oh, we see that all the time, therefore it mustn't be anything. So tuning your logs down, so your logs are generating the right amount of information, and then tuning your rules. So if we've got rules looking for people attempting to brute force, and we have to tweak what those values are for our users, because when they ship out the factory, it's like if somebody tries 5 times followed by a successful login, then you've just been brute forced. Arguably, somebody could have forgotten their password and they've tried 5 times and logged in. So you have to take context into account with those default rules and tweak them and tune them for what your organization needs. And that's how SOCs work. And we used to have a weekly meeting a place I've worked where it was like, let's have a look at the false positive rate. Let's have a look at the rules. Let's see where we can tune them up, tune them down, remove them, add more coverage, or adjust the logs. It's like I said, it's full-time work for a security team to monitor this. And the larger your organization gets, the more data you have, the more traffic you have, the more logs you have to analyze, the easier it is to slip something through.
And I assume now, since the intelligence agencies have vastly expanded the people that are monitoring their own people, I assume that must have happened.
I can't believe that they weren't before. I can't believe that an intelligence agency isn't, closely watching logs to see how data is being accessed. They must be. So it feels to me like what this actually ended up being was a little bit of a perfect storm. The fact that he was controlling or was administering a system that was handling documents, like in this case the SharePoint server. It feels to me like the SharePoint thing is actually the root of all of the problems, because he was able to have this system begin to ingest more and more and more data that he had, as Kev has already said, kind of almost godlike access to. And so the idea that he was maneuvering or manipulating that data in some way would not have seemed like an anomaly to those looking at those logs. And I think that's probably what ended up happening. When there was a load of conjecture going on about what he had done back, back when this happened, there was all this stuff about, he must have escalated privileges, or he must have social engineered people, or, all this clever stuff that he must have done. Like one of them was even like, he must have forged certificates and all this stuff. But the reality may have been that he was a guy in Hawaii running SharePoint, and he just wasn't getting watched that closely.
It's very easy to look at the more complex things. Like when we talk about malware infections, like they get really complex. They privesk, they hide themselves, they avoid detection. They've got really complex C2, but we've got really good detections on that. The insider threat is the thing that's so hard to think about, and especially when you take it away from a normal user. So a normal, and I don't want to belittle all salespeople or non-technical groups, but they don't recognize, they don't understand your systems, they don't understand how data flows. So it's going to be significantly harder for that tier of your organization. When you hit the admins, they understand the systems, they understand the network, they understand where stuff's being logged, where it's being noted, so they can work around that. And if you've got I would say that if you've got a disgruntled admin, there is nothing you can do that will stop them taking data. If they want to, they're going to get it out, and you wouldn't know until afterwards.
I feel like, and there are privileged access management systems exist in order to attempt to address this challenge through things like audit trail and screen recording and all that kind of stuff. But it feels like that's still quite a hard thing to implement in a widespread way that still means it's effective, because at the end of the day, as you just said, Kev, it still comes down to that one person who, because they administer the system, they have access to all the data. And it feels to me like we might have been having this conversation for the last 20 years. Why is it still that the way that networks work mean that because you administer a system, you have access to all the data on it? There's got to be a better way of making something work than that.
There is, and you can compartmentalize. So you can say that the servers have access to that data, and I have access to configure the servers, but don't have access to the raw data. But again, you're going to hit a point where if I'm administering the server and I'm telling it what it's allowed to do, then I can just add whatever rules I want in. So what you get into is you get like checks and balances. So as an administrator, I will have another administrator, and he will review the audit logs and go, actually, Kev, why did you disable all audit logging for the top secret folder? That seems a bit odd to me. So it's having those checks and balances, not having any one person with all the control, or if you do, have somebody else with the same level of access that you also trust, and they're checking each other, like that 2-man rule.
Anyway, right, on the internet at the minute, General Keith Alexander, has become a director on AWS's board of directors. And so now, and think about how ridiculous this is. Now, Snowden, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, blah, 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 like people are like... I'm surprised the Guardian's not in there somewhere. I'm sure it will be. The Libertarian Party. They're having a massive rant about the fact that now AWS is spying on you because General Keith Alexander has joined the board. Could it possibly be the case that AWS want to win the $1 billion Jedi contract, and that's why they put the ex-director of NSA on the board? Not because he's going to completely corrupt the whole of AWS to spy on your websites that are hosted on AWS. Ridiculous!
I thought the US government had already given it to Microsoft. Let's talk, while we still have time, though, quickly about Eternal Blue.
NSA had a load of tools compromised. Is that? Do I have to say allegedly on this, or is this actually known fact?
No, that's in the public domain. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was after I left, so I know nothing about it. So it's brilliant. I can definitely talk about this. So it was an internal contractor that leaked their tool set.
So Shadow Brokers was an internal contractor who had access. So it's the exact same flow.
Stuff being used by the National Security Agency or by the intelligence services or security services then gets leaked and now is like in widespread use amongst cyber criminals and all sorts of malicious actors, and that means that there's not just a responsibility for an agency like that to control their data for the purposes of protecting, maybe in the case of Snowden, protecting their own reputation or protecting their operational integrity, but also they had a responsibility to protect the citizens of the world, which it seems like they failed to do by allowing, all these other threat actors to now start using something like Eternal Blue for things like WannaCry, now a shit ton of other threats, including, of course, cryptocurrency miners.
What's really,
think I'm joking?
the thing you're putting your finger on, interestingly there, Chris, is that the fact that if this was agency released or cache of 0 days, of course, in the wrong hands has then resulted in a load of actual malicious actors installing crypto miners. But of course, they could have just done the responsible disclosure.
They really should have. The other thing is, this was 4 years after Snowden. That's quite a long time to try to put in place, securing that infrastructure. Even officials going on the record saying, clearly a bad job was done of securing this stuff when it's so potentially powerful and destructive. There's as much of a weight of responsibility on securing that stuff as there is, I would say, on securing, things like, personal information and stuff like that. So can we think of anything else that we wanted to cut? I mean, we obviously haven't covered everything.
I think there's one thing I'd like to say. And again, regardless of whether you think he did the right thing or the wrong thing, like security on the internet is significantly more improved. The levels of privacy we have as individuals significantly improved, and they're a direct ramification of the kind of things he was talking about. So these projects are talking about dragnets, they're talking about cable intercepts, and technologies like Google, like Amazon, like most mail providers, HTTPS, have put blocks in place that prevent that from happening. So even if somebody was able to intercept, they wouldn't be able to do anything with the data without significant levels of support from the organizations running it.
Whilst I'm all in favour of balance, I think you might be suffering here from a bout of correlation causation, Kev. I think what we've seen over the last 7 years is the internet security has improved, no question, but computing power's got higher, so it's easier to do SSL termination more frequently everywhere. So I don't think you can credit that shitbag with all of that.
Don't thank Snowden, thank Moore's Law. It's just a fact.
Thank Moore's Law. Thank you. Yeah.
That seems like a great place to come to an end. Turns out Cybersecurity Podcast ends up saying, you know what? Moore's Law is a thing. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe, rate, and comment wherever you get your audio content. And if you want to know more about Immersive Labs, you can find us at immersivelabs.com or follow us on Twitter at Immersive Labs UK. Until next time, from all of us, goodbye.
Bye.
Hey, you know what? I think we did pretty well there, boys. I don't feel like I'm about to go to jail. Anybody else think I'm about to go to jail?